Everyone hear me okay? Yep. So I'd like to welcome everyone to this seminar in our series of Anthropocene Histories. Today's seminar is on the great economization of the ocean, following cod and doing empirical economy. We have long wanted to have a session particularly on the Anthropocene and the sea, and we're very happy to have that Kristin, Asdal and Huse accepted our invitation to talk about their wonderful book, which I'm going to hold up, which is the nature-made economy, cod capital and the great economization of the ocean. So in their talk, Kristin and Tone will discuss how the ocean in the years preceding World War II has been harnessed to become a space of ever-intensifying capital investment and innovation. And then, so they will introduce general themes to the book, and then focus in some ways on the cod and the domestication and idea of it as biocapital, among other themes. We had planned a response from Tamara Fernando as advertised. I think she's having computer issues and not being able to join, but I hope she will be able to. What happens next, I will briefly introduce our speakers. They're going to give a combined talk, after which there will be plenty of time for questions. So Kristin Asdal is Professor of STS at Teak Centre for Technology, Innovation and Culture at the University of Oslo. Her research focuses on the sociology of knowledge across economics and natural science, and on how scientific expertise is partaking in democracy. Tone Huse is Associate Professor of STS at WWII, the Arctic University of Norway. Her research looks at placemaking politics, economizations, and colonialisms of the Arctic. Her work spans historical as well as contemporary research, is radically interdisciplinary, and committed to experimenting with new means for interacting with broad publics. So we're very much looking forward to hearing their talk about the Anthropocene and the ocean.
Well, thank you so much, Sophie. Should we just start then?
I think so.
Yes. Okay. Excellent. Thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation to give this talk and to talk about our book. And the book, it is, as you also showed us, it's a result of our collaboration in the ERC Starting Grant project, enacting the good economy, biocapitalization, and the little tools of valuation, which then was led by Kristin, and where I was a postdoctoral fellow. And it builds on quite extensive empirical studies, which we'll get back to quite shortly, and it is then co-authored by the two of us.
And so, as you so nicely introduced already, Sophie, the main character of this book is the Atlantic cod, fished to near extinction in North America, but previously a source of great wealth also here. It is today a species that thrives in great numbers in the oceans of Norway and Russia, Iceland and Karalit Nunat. The cod holds both old and new markets across the world. And as we describe in one of the book's chapters, it is currently trying to take on emerging mega markets in the East, which is perhaps why people along the Norwegian coast like to call it the white gold of the ocean.
So every year then, when springtime closes upon the ocean, the sexually mature cod makes its journey from the far north Barents Sea to its spawning grounds along the Norwegian coast. It smells like money, people like to say, as fisheries gets busy and the docks start to smell quite fishy. And it is then this species that we travel with and learn from in analyzing what we call the great economization of the ocean.
And from that notion, some of you might catch that there are also other figures that we take on board, and one of them being Karl Polanyi and the work he's very well known for, The Great Transformation. Published just as World War II was about to end, The Great Transformation describes the rise of what Polanyi calls market society in the 18th and 19th centuries, delivered with a stark critique of what he saw as the cataclysmic effects of capitalism. Up until then, Polanyi writes, land, nature, and economy had been tied up with tightly woven social institutions, like the church, the guild, the village, and the neighborhood. No, land was being disconnected from such community context and subordinated to the market mechanism, the orderings of markets. So the great transformation of our book sets out to analyze not the land, the transformation of land, but instead the transformation of the ocean. And also, it is not so much about introducing a novel economic order as it is about extending the reach and intensity of capital and industry, economizing, in other words, the ocean.
And then the notion of economization as it's applied in our book stems from social studies of markets, a field that grows out of both economic sociology and science and technology studies, STS, and then their engagement with American pragmatist thinkers. And in this tradition, importantly, emphasis is put on that of rendering and not on any substantive definition of what economic should mean. The economic is rather considered as the outcome of a process of exactly economization. So this implies then that the economy cannot be grasped as a pre-existing reality, nor as regulated by a specific inner logic. In fact, there are no economic laws to discover, nor any specific mechanisms that can be expected to be triggered by specific actions. So instead, this perspective invites us to consider the economy as an ongoing achievement.
So one quite strong illustration of what the great economization of the ocean can entail is this image that you can see here from the front cover of a report by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD. The ocean, this tells us, is to be exploited at all depths and at all scales. No surface is to be left untouched. All its beings are potential sources of new forms of biocapitalization, a term that we'll focus on and return to in a few times today. Chapter by chapter, Nature-Made Economy sets out to show the conditions of possibility such ambitions rest on. We show that what we today can recognize as a great transformation builds on long-standing efforts, laborious experiments, as well as controversies, environmental troubles, mass losses of life in the ocean, and other quite spectacular failings. So the question then, one of the questions at least, is how to study such great transformations. One could imagine that to study great transformations, what we need are great tools, large numbers, statistics, and overviews. What we propose instead is the notion of little tools and little tools of valuation. And we apply these together with the notions of valuation arrangements and value orderings.
So as we formulate and work with these concepts, they are made to move across the material and the semiotic, across the quantitative and the qualitative, across markets and state bodies, and then lastly, across nature and economy. The concept of little tools, be they a document, a brand, a market survey, or a price tag, is meant to capture that these little tools can, in and of themselves, be quite mundane. But then when put to work, they tie up with and enable the workings of larger apparatuses and valuation arrangements. So little should not be mistaken for insignificant. Instead, it draws attention to an empirical and methodological level that we find is especially apt for capturing what we argue are versions of economization.
So each of the book's chapters, and maybe we should perhaps say that it can be downloaded actually for free at the MIT Press. So each of the book's chapters are written so that they can be read alone. They carry a world, so to speak, a story and a problematic of its own. And the book can also be read chronologically. It starts with the deep sea petroleum industry in the 60s and ends with how the cod performs in emerging Chinese markets for domestic seafood consumption. Put bluntly, our research puzzle is this. The field of social studies of markets and valuation studies, much inspired by SDS scholars and research, have done a lot to open up the economy to empirical research. At the same time, SDS and environmental humanities have opened cultural and social studies to multi-species relations and emphasized nature and its various agencies. Yet, surprisingly, the two fields of research seldom meet. In social studies of markets, nature agencies remain surprisingly absent. In fact, leading scholars in this field, Koray Kaliskan and Michel Callot, which we are very much inspired on in many ways in the book, still they argue that pacification is integral to economization. So our study shows and argues the opposite. Throughout the book, we show and argue how nature, the ocean, the Atlantic cod, acts upon economy. There is co-modifications, we argue. Nature economies is a relational affair.
So as we move on then, we will focus on one such co-modification effort to bringing nature and economy together. An effort that in many ways starts out already in 1886 with Gunder Mathisen Dannevig, a sailor and a scientist who aspired to help the cod fisheries by artificially breeding cod juveniles and setting them free to grow in the ocean. Here, he hypothesized, they could grow into large cod bodies ripe for fishes to capture, a form of aquatic sowing and reaping. To rear and to raise the cod, Dannevig, however, finds, is quite difficult. Working out of the Flødevigen biological station at the very southern tip of Norway, he notes that the cod is a rather fierce little creature. July 10, Dannevig writes, after I, yesterday and today, in quiet and clear sunny weather, with the greatest attention, have observed the life and conduct of the young cod, I have arrived at the result that they attack, kill, and eat one another at quite a substantial scale. The co-modification efforts that we write about in our book, and in then chapter 3 of the book in particular, also have their origin at Flødevigen, though at a much later stage, almost 100 years later, in 1975, when a group of scientists take up the challenge of breeding cod juveniles. Inspired by early 20th century research on fish stock fluctuations, and still holding this aspiration to help cod stocks in the wild to grow, the scientists make two hypotheses. Firstly, that cod larvae survival rates, that cod survival could be improved if the cod larvae are allowed first to grow in a predator-free environment. And then the second hypothesis they make is that laboratory-reared cod juveniles can in fact survive in the ocean, in the wild.
So we approach this as a form of domestication. But as we do so, we intervene in this field of research and add to this argument and reasoning that, and also like we do in other parts of the book and in our general discussions, by insisting that we should not separate the study of economy and nature or consider the one as being the shaping force of the other. We need instead, as we put it, to look at how they co-modify one another. So we argue against then predominant framings of domestication as a unilateral process of human mastery over non-human species. And we align with newer perspectives that emphasize domestication as an open-ended, relational, and mutual process involving humans, non-humans, and their environments, and of course also technologies. But we don't stop at this, because whereas domestication studies tend to treat economic as an outside force shaping the exploitations of nature for profit purposes, what we also emphasize is how entities being drawn into economy also work upon and shape the economic relations of which they are part. This is also an intervention towards social studies of markets, which, as we touched upon earlier in our introduction, presumes that for something to become a commodity exchangeable in economic markets, pacification must find place, or the topic of nature is kind of very often simply overlooked. So, cod goods, as we show throughout the book, are not passive, neither those that are ocean captured, nor the ones that are sought domesticated. Instead, they demand constant work and attention, and to work with in ways that the propensities of the cod directs, be it propensities to rot, and therefore demanding chilled infrastructures of travel, or its propensity to escape from net pens in the sea, which then has earned it the nickname, the Houdini of the sea.
So returning then to WWII in 1975 again, and the group of scientists that we here follow who are trying then to raise cod juveniles. At WWII, they have at their disposal a saltwater pool of 4,000 cubic meters. And in the spring, they release 200,000 laboratory hatched cod larvae into this pool. After a year, by 1976, only 100 of these little codfish have survived. The next year, they are, however, more successful, and in 1977 then, they managed to raise as many as 44,000 cod juveniles, which then allows them to proceed to the next phase of their experiments. They now take 371 cod juveniles, tag them, and release them into the ocean. A while later, 38 of these have been recaptured. The growth rates of the released cod are compared to that of the wild cod. The comparison shows similar growth patterns, result then that strengthens the hypothesis that domestically hatched and reared cod juveniles can indeed survive in the ocean, that is, in the wild. For the scientists, this is seen as a success that then breeds another vision, the vision to scale up cod farming for industrial production. So the focus shifts then from understanding cod survival to a new aspiration of mastering the cod's reproduction and growth in fish farms. And as the aim of the experiments changes, so does their venue, moving from WWII in the south to the newly established marine aquaculture station, which is situated on the west coast outside of Bergen. And here a new site for experimentation is being built. Taking a natural inlet, the scientists build a dam, the dam closing off the inlet and allowing them control over what species move in and out of it, creating now a much larger experimental site of 60,000 cubic meters. They now are ready in 1980 to proceed. And then approximately 2 million cod larvae are released into the pond, and only 150 survive, a result described by the scientists themselves as catastrophic. The following couple of years, results improve slightly, but are still quite meager. Only 10,000 cod survive. Why? Studying the pond and the tiny little cod, the scientists make yet another hypothesis. The cod are not getting enough to eat, and when hungry, they resort to cannibalism, just as observed by WWII. almost then 100 years ago. Newly hatched cod, they come to realize, are too small to digest artificial feed. They need live feed provided by the ocean. That is, they need zooplankton that hatches around the same time as the cod spawns naturally and that grows in nature parallel to the cod larvae. So the scientists then realize that the productions of nature, so to say, are timed. And so they also would need to time the release of the cod larvae so that it can be growing in parallel to the zooplankton. And doing so, in 1983, they ensure then that the cod is provided with adequate and not the least properly sized food and achieve what they describe in their research reports as a major breakthrough.
So to sum up a little bit, this is a co-modification that involved synchronizing the reproductive and growth rhythms of both cod and the zooplankton, mimicking the natural timing found in the wild to improve survival rates. Through this, the scientists achieved a reduction of cannibalism and also increased survival rates. And it also increased productivity, not only biologically, but also economically. Co-modification then can be described as a two-way process where biological entities and their environments are modified to fit economic goals, or to put it more concretely, to perform well in a fish farm economy. And in the book, we explore these efforts to control and harness the reproduction and growth of the cod through the notion of biocapital and biocapitalization. So, where does this notion of biocapital stem from? It stems partly from works by scholars who you might know, like Kushik Sundarayan, most recently, but also earlier Sarah Franklin, who have problematized how biological entities are worked upon so that they come to have the potential when put to work to produce kind of to work as a form of biocapital and to kind of produce economy and when they are put into economic relations. So often when we think of capital, we think of money being invested, the investment yielding a profit and a surplus that in turn can be reinvested, accumulating the wealth of its owner, the investor. Biocapital is a form of capital whose potential for accumulation is hinged on biological forms of reproduction and growth. Put simply, and in our case, on the cod's propensity to spawn and reproduce. In this way, the cod already exists as a form of biocapital in the ocean as cod stocks. So, for instance, mark how these are named, the associations to stock in stock markets, so that the relation here is already quite clear. But when drawn into domestication efforts, we argue, the properties of cod are being worked upon, subjecting it to what we conceive of as a form of biocapitalization that seeks to harness and control, to enhance its capacity to reproduce and grow, and to enhance its accumulative properties. So these properties, however, they are not passive. Instead, they tie in with how the cod acts and acts upon the economic, co-modifies it again, which we then in the book point to as the behavioral aspects to biocapital. So there are, we suggest, behavioral aspects to biocapital. These actions, we show, can enhance, resist, or complicate efforts to transform living beings into forms of biocapital. But can they also be, but also the very things that makes biocapitalization possible is, after all, the cod's propensity to eat and grow and live. And it's this that generates its so-called biomass increase and therefore the weight gain and growth necessary for it to achieve, as we describe in other chapters of the book, market weight, and thereby become a valued good and market commodity.
So our story of biocapitalization, however, it does not stop with our temporal alignment of cod and zooplankton growth. It continues, perhaps curiously for some, at least it was for us when we started to learn about this, with efforts to condition the cod and train it to abide by sound signals. And now the full story of this is in the book. So for those of you who are interested in the nitty-gritty of cod conditioning, you can read chapter 3. But in short, this was an experiment that applied Pavlovian methods to train the cod to associate sound signals with feeding. If the cod could be called upon to eat, the scientists were asking, could it also be trusted to stay put where the food was being provided? And if it could be trusted to do so, could one actually remove the cost of fish pens and other enclosure technologies from fish farming? So to try and do so became then the last in their string of experiments and the ones that we follow, when in 1986, 1,584 cod conditioned to abide by a sound signal were released into a bay. Initially, the bay was closed off, a net preventing the cod from swimming away. But as cameras and divers observed the cod to calm down and to show up when the sound signal for feeding time was given, the net was removed. To the scientists' initial disappointment, the cod dispersed and disappeared as soon as they were given a chance to do so. But over the course of a few weeks, small shoals of cod began returning to the feeding site, gradually responding to the sound signal and forming patterns of movement around the artificial current where food was being released. Not only a form of biocapital which one has learned how to grow, timing its growth with that of others, this was now also a form of biocapital modified so that production could be carried out by using less labor and less technical or cheaper technical facilities. It was a cod saving cost, and then in a position to accumulate wealth faster. And in fact, the remaining cod, it adapted not only to the feeding regime, it also began to influence wild cod and also other fish species to adopt similar behaviors, recruiting, as the scientists said, and creating a mixed population of fish that were feeding off the feeding machines, blurring the boundaries between the domesticated and the wild fish. And the scientists were quite puzzled on how to treat this, because when they were now feeding also other fish that had no commercial value, what was indeed the value of this arrangement, right? So in this case, one can say that it was the cod's habitat and its non-cod companions that were troubling efforts to modify the cod and enhance it as a form of biocapital. Kristin.
Yes. So time is running fast, so we are now moving towards the concluding part of our shared talk. So and about the kind of the lessons that we at least we have drawn from our study and that we might discuss, because one of the lessons that we take from our study of the ocean and its great transformations is that this is a nature space which to a large extent is quite unknown to us. Contrary to agriculture, whose lands and living species have been cultivated and domesticated for thousands of years, aquaculture is quite new. Having been in force, large scale at least, for only 5 decades or so, we are breaking, if not new ground, if not completely new ground, at least new waters, or also even troubling waters. And so, as we return to this image of OECD, if you have it here, yes. If we return to this image and visions put forward by the OECD of an ocean economized through and through, different versions of overlapping and competing over its depths and surfaces, this book of ours is perhaps also one that comes with a plea for humility, for setting a transformation pace that allows for our interactions to find place with care, also for the natures upon which we seek to capitalize. To conclude then, what we do in this book is what we suggest calling empirical economy. Not so unlike the notion of empirical philosophy put forward by Anne-Marie Moll, we take this to signify an analytics that is grounded not in predetermined principles about what economy is, but that seeks to understand economy by way of how it comes about in practice, and so also what economy does. In its most basic sense, empirical economy is about studying economy as it unfolds and comes into being. It is about attending to the practices of economy. Empirical economy is to trace these, as we suggest, versions of economization, how these emerge, unfold, stabilize, are disrupted, and even destroyed, and about how this takes the form of patterned realities and consequently has real life consequences. Thank you. And we need to add that all illustrations of the codfish, as you can see here on the slides, are drawn actually by the zoologist Georg Ossian-Sars, who was just as interested as us in the Atlantic cod in the late 19th century. And the pictures are borrowed from National Library of Norway, and it accompanies every chapter of our book.
Brilliant.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. That was excellent.